I'm Casey Arrillaga, and I am a clinician here at Windmill Wellness Ranch, which is the Drug and Alcohol Treatment Center. So the biopsychosocial model takes three major factors into account. There's bio or biological, that's everything going on inside our body. Psychological, that's everything happening in our mind. And social, which really means everything in our environment. So the biological factors, the biggest one by far, of course, is genetics. And it turns out genetics are currently estimated 40 to 60% of the deal, so we're going to roughly estimate that and say 50% of this is genetic. That's really kind of a big thing to look at. Now, the thing about that is there is not one addiction gene. There's not something we look at and say, well, if you get this gene, you're going to be an addict. If not, you won't. What really happens instead is genes all affect each other, and then it turns out our environment affects our genes. So you hit certain environmental triggers or cues or experiences that you have, and a gene that might never have expressed or had an effect on your life can suddenly have a profound effect. But it also turns out that that gene may affect the next gene down the line, and the one after that, and the one after that. So it really depends on what combination you get. So for instance, there are some genes that really influence how somebody absorbs dopamine, which is a chemical that tells us the next thing is going to be great. So if somebody grows up with genetics that maybe need more dopamine to get an effect, what will happen is they will go out and seek more and more stimulation as children. And then somewhere, usually around adolescence, somebody says, here, drink this, smoke that, snort this thing, and the brain lights up and says, you've finally given me what I've been needing all along. That person walked into a trap. The person next to them, the person on the other side, may do the exact same behaviors and not walk into that trap. But then you might have somebody else who doesn't have that same genetic twist, who over time, slowly with, say, repetitive use of alcohol or some other drug, finds that they're becoming more and more dependent on it. Other genes that they have are just responding to that drug in a way that, again, might not happen for their spouse or their children or their parents. And so as a result, we'll find that people will either very quickly or slowly over time slide into addiction and find themselves making different choices. So that's the biological part. Now, the environmental part or social part is a huge factor as well. That is most of the rest of the picture. And that has to do with experiences that we might have, which could be things from what kind of drug use we did experience as kids, maybe in parents or friends. Could also be, though, that maybe our family was super strict. We never touch any of those things. We become teenagers and look around and say, well, I need to be different than my family. Let me go check out this thing that we never do, and we're off and running. Other people might find certain socioeconomic circumstances are more prevalent. For instance, if you grow up in an area where life just sort of seems hopeless, nobody's getting anywhere, maybe it's a small town, maybe it's a neighborhood where everybody is just down. Economically, it doesn't seem like there's much choice or chance in life. It becomes much easier. And so we see addiction really blossom more so in those areas. But there's no socioeconomic status or area in life or area of the country, area of the world where addiction isn't possible or doesn't happen. We just find it's more prevalent. So we'll say that's an environmental factor. But one of the biggest factors is trauma. And trauma, I like to say, is in the eye of the beholder. So it's not a given thing that a certain experience will be traumatic for someone, but there are certain experiences that are traumatic for most people, such as childhood abuse or maybe being in a horrific car accident. And there's other things that maybe we didn't think of that can really affect somebody's vulnerability to addiction, which could be experiences that feel traumatic but don't look traumatic from the outside, like, say, being adopted. So someone might be adopted at birth. We don't think of that as being a traumatic experience, but the way the child experiences it is that I suddenly lost everybody, and I don't know where I am in the world. And the mother, the heartbeat that I grew up with, even if I'm adopted at birth, that heartbeat is suddenly gone, her voice is gone, there's new people around, and I might make a decision, depending on my genes and other factors, might make a decision I can't trust anybody. If I can't trust anybody, I go through life feeling nervous, anxious, not really certain of my place anymore. And again, somebody comes along and says, this behavior, this drug, whatever, try this, and I suddenly feel my whole system relax. It's really hard to say to somebody who's 13 years old, you know what, that's only for the grown-ups, shouldn't do that. And the reality is it makes it very easy for somebody to slide into those kind of behaviors or suddenly embrace them and say, this is my way of life. So those are environmental factors. We see other things like advertising in the media, availability in our neighborhood, all those sorts of things will also be environmental factors that have an impact. But now we're going to look at how those two things all affect psychologically, because biopsychosocial, this is the psycho part. We're not saying people are psycho, we're saying it's their psychology. So when we look at somebody's psychology, the kind of things that make somebody more vulnerable to addiction would be things, first and foremost, like low self-esteem, high anxiety, tendency towards depression, any kind of psychiatric condition, actually. So bipolar, schizophrenia, anything like that, the comorbidity or the co-occurrence with addiction is very high. And there's some things like depression where we might say, well, I've been drinking alcohol to get rid of my depression. But we find with studies, actually, over time, the more you drink alcohol, the more depressed you tend to get. Now, that could be because the effects alcohol has on your body, and then for other people, it's simply going to be that your life circumstances become more and more depressing over the more you drink. So when we look at all three factors of those, we see they influence each other, and they can get somebody to a downward spiral. Somebody has a genetic predisposition, they're more vulnerable, they go through certain experiences which affect their thinking, and your thinking can actually affect how your genes express. So if you're feeling more depressed and you have genes that have a tendency towards depression, that depression will spiral more so than for somebody else who maybe feels a little depressed, a little down, and then they find that they sort of naturally buoy back up. You get enough of those factors together and somebody just starts to spiral downwards. Luckily, there's an upward spiral in recovery. We'll get to that in just a minute. But these are the kind of things that influence how somebody becomes caught up in the cycle of addiction.